Bueno, la siguiente ponente viene desde el Reino Unido. Ella es Joe Ferguson. Lleva más de 10 años trabajando, en este caso, con el otro grupo típico de la especie, el grupo objetivo de conservación en muchas de estas cosas que estamos hablando, que son los murciélagos. Como sabéis, es un grupo que está protegido y amenazado en lo que se refiere a nuestro entorno en el País Vasco, pues al 100%. Todas las especies están en algún grado de amenaza en el catálogo vasco de especies amenazadas. Y no todas ellas, lógicamente, utilizan la ciudad, no todas ellas se pueden ver beneficiadas de lo que aquí vamos a tratar, pero sí muchas de ellas, y algunas de ellas de alto interés de conservación. Joe Ferguson lleva trabajando con estos temas, como he dicho antes, más de 10 años y actualmente pues, es una consultora experta que asesora en procesos de edificación, de construcción de nuevas infraestructuras, de usos comerciales, etcétera, y en donde, aparte de llevar a cabo la propia inventariación de las especies de murciélagos que habitan en estos lugares o que pueden habitar, establece a su vez medidas para intentar integrar la conservación de estos animales en estas infraestructuras. Pertenece al Bat Conservation Trust y también pues, al grupo de murciélagos de Londres y a diversas organizaciones para la defensa de estos animales. Por tanto, una experta y que además está ligada a una de las publicaciones que hemos podido localizar en el ámbito extranjero más interesantes y que tiene que ver con la integración de estas medidas en la edificación. Esa publicación, por cierto, la tenéis en uno de los stands que hay fuera y realmente merece también la pena, como sin duda la guía de Segovia que nos ha presentado Miguel Ángel. Y sin más, le cedo la palabra yo.
Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes, gracias por permitirme que hable hoy. Me llamo Joanna Ferguson and I am the Built Environment Officer for the Bat Conservation Trust. The Bat Conservation Trust has been actually going for about 25 years now. However, my role and the project has been going since about 2007, when we realised, as we've talked a little bit today, about the real challenges but also the opportunities that the built environment sector presents to both bats and also other biodiversity. My project does a whole range of things in relation to the built environment in the UK. We run bat awareness training. We also work really closely with some of our partner organisations to help them develop best practice in-house. But we also develop best practice guidance documents such as the Designing for Biodiversity. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about this document later on and some of the technical elements primarily in relation to bats. I'm a bat ecologist, not surprisingly, but my background is in general urban ecology. So I'll also touch on the information from some of our partner organisations who worked with us to develop the guidance, people like the RSPB and Swift Conservation. So the reason I would just like to say, I hope you don't mind me standing. Originally, when we talked about this, I was told there may be 30 to 60 people, and obviously it's fantastic to see that there's 3 times as many, but leaves you with a little bit of nervous energy, so it's probably better that I'm standing rather than sitting down and fidgeting. That is really fantastic. So many people here that, that are really interested, that are really passionate and that are really knowledgeable about this subject. A great day to hear about. Everybody talks, but also to network, and I look forward to meeting a few of you after I've done my talk and I'm a little bit less nervous. So, why are we all here today? Well, we're here because we're starting to realise that there are a number of species that can be considered building reliant. They've adapted to our urban environments, they've adapted to our built environment, and actually this is now starting to provide a really valuable habitat for them. So we're talking bird species, as we've seen already, peregrine falcons, house sparrows and swifts, and some of our bat species, such as the common pipistrelle and the brown long-eared. Now, I'm going to, like I say, focus on bats primarily and come on to birds a little bit later. And first, I'd like to sort of give a little bit of background in bat ecology to give, I guess, a real understanding of why they use the built environment, how they can be impacted, and also some of the sort of challenges and, like I say, the opportunities that the built environment presents to bat species. Now, in the UK, we have 18 species that breed there, and this is of around 1,390 worldwide at the last count. It seems to be every time I consult a new expert, and another few species go onto the list. So, you know, a considerable number of species worldwide. They're found on all of the continents apart from, again, I used to say the Arctic and the Antarctic, but apparently we're now finding them within the Arctic Circle, so just the Antarctic for now. And, you know, they're really fantastically adapted to the nocturnal environment. Our insectivorous bats have been pretty much unchanged from fossil records for about 50 million years. And when you consider the rate of urbanization, you really realize why they're struggling, some of them more than others, to adapt. And when we think about, you know, can they adapt, how they adapt, we can think in the UK of our species falling into two rough groups. The slow-flying species with the shorter, broader wings, and this relates to the fact that they often hunt their prey in cluttered environments, and they're coming in, and quite often they can pick prey even off the vegetation. The faster flying species are long, tapered wings, and they're chasing their prey items out in the open environment, and so they're much more used to being out in that open environment and be able to move faster through it. And when we think about how they're adapted to hunting their prey and whether they're slow flying or fast flying, we start to consider, well, how open are they to predation? And when we start to understand that, we start to see which species are going to be more impacted and feel that, I guess, that threat of predation more keenly than others. And so, you know, I talked about, you know, and a lot of people have touched on this really increased rate of urbanisation. And for us in the UK, it's a massive issue because of the real declines in bat populations over the last century. So some species, such as our greater horseshoe, have lost up to 90% of their original populations. We're seeing some slow recovery of the 11 species that we monitor through the National Bat Monitoring Programme, our citizen science programme in the UK. We're seeing stabilisation of all of our 11 species, and we're seeing an increase in 3 of those species. But obviously, it's a huge difference compared to where we were 100 years or so ago. And, you know, there's loss in severe declines, loss in population is due to things like, you know, severance and loss of roosting, foraging and commuting habitats. And this is through things like changing in agricultural practice, but also how we've modified our buildings and how we've modified our built environment. But, and I get asked this quite a lot, but, you know, apart from, you know, their intrinsic value, they're fascinating creatures, you know, why is this important to us? Well, bats are one of our bioindicator species. So where we have a healthy local bat population, we have a healthy local environment. And we're, you know, originally we're thinking that was just for the wildlife and the plants that were there, but also we're beginning now to understand that that means a healthy local environment for ourselves, how it impacts our physical and mental well-being, and even things like productivity in our workplace and schools, and how quickly people are recovering in hospital. So having a good bat population and understanding our bat populations really helps us feed into how we manage the built environment for the benefit of all of us, for people and nature. Bats are also fantastic for pest control. So all of our UK bat species are insectivorous. They take this really energy-rich diet in the nocturnal environment, so they're not competing against these daytime birds, swifts, swallows, house martins, and it provides a lot of energy for these really energy-rich activities, so flight, echolocation to enable them to see in the dark and to pick their prey out in the dark, and also keeping their bodies warm in our temperate climate. They're incredibly small mammals, and they lose heat very easily. So, you know, the insects provide this fantastic resource for them, but obviously we have a major problem where we are in our temperate climes in that in the winter we have no food resource and it's incredibly cold for them. So how do they maintain their body temperature and how do they survive even in peaks of cold where you may notice a drop in insect populations, even as we're seeing at the moment in summers or spring where we had a lot of snow. So bats have a particular survival strategy, and what they're trying to do is they're constantly trying to match their body temperature to the surrounding temperature of their roost site. And depending on what type of roost site it is, or depending on what kind of temperature needs that they have. So for example, in the summer when they have young, these young are completely furless when they're born, and I often compare them to a baked bean with wings. That's the kind of size we're dealing with. That's the, you know, they've got no fur. So they want to be in an incredibly warm roost, and we're talking probably 35 degrees plus. Anybody who's been in their roof space in the summer and finds it unbearable, that's the kind of heat that bats are looking for. It means that all of the energy they take from their food, they can turn into milk, and then all of that gets to feed their young, because the young only have a couple of months to go from a tiny baked bean size to be fully furred, able to fly, and to be able to leave their roost site. On the complete opposite end of that, they go into hibernation in the winter. So they will, when there's no food resource and it's really cold, they will drop their body temperature. They can drop it to around 2 degrees. They'll find somewhere that's very cool, and there's also very damp, so they're not going to sort of dry out while they're hibernating. And they can stay there for 4 months or so, something like that, if the temperature is constant during that time. And hopefully you can start to see now, and we've touched on things like climate change, how much of an issue it is when we're having these warmer, wetter winters. Bats are waking up, they're coming out, they're trying to feed, there is no insects for them, and they're actually burning through some of the body fat that they have on them. And this is a major issue, particularly when we think about population recovery and we think about the females. So what happens in the autumn is that bats mate, and females will actually store that sperm over winter, and only when they come out in the spring, if they're in good body condition, will they become pregnant. And if they're not, if they're thin, if they've lost a lot of body fat due to being disturbed during the hibernation period, then they won't become pregnant. And that is probably true of a number of bats, or the whole population of bats for that area, because they're likely to have been impacted either by climate or by disturbance. So we say that the two really critical times for bats in terms of their impact of disturbance is the summer during the maternity period where they have babies, and also in the winter when they're hibernating. The disturbance is a massive problem alongside the loss of roosts, because those mothers with their babies will actually abandon their babies if they're disturbed. They won't sort of stick around, and we have a lot of sort of anecdotal evidence from people who say, oh, I've been in a roof space and the bats will fly at me and try and attack me. And that's absolutely not true. The bats, they'll panic, they'll be sort of panicking and flying around, and then they'll actually potentially leave without their babies. So, you know, there's the obvious things such as the loss of roosts or blocking access to roosts and damaging roosts, but also disturbance is a major issue as well, like I say, especially during the maternity period. So when I use the term roost, what am I really talking about? So a roost is any structure or place which bats use for shelter or protection, and that's whether they're occupied or not. And so hopefully you can start to see from the last slide how each of their roosts is a key piece in the jigsaw puzzle that allows them to complete their life cycle. If you pull one of those away, if you remove one of those roosts, then it's a major issue for them. And so that's why we say in the UK they're protected whether they're occupied or not, because if a bat comes back, say, to have young and there's no roost there, it might mean that the young don't survive that year. Given that I've touched on how disturbance is a real issue for them, and how particular they are about their roost sites, and they're very roost faithful. They'll come back year after year because they know they've got somewhere safe that's near a good feeding resource, that they can either raise their young or they can see out the hibernation period. Why do bats use our buildings? Why are they coming into contact with us? Well, it won't be surprising to sort of go through the reasons. A lot of their natural roosting habitat is now missing or has become more disturbed. Certainly in the UK, places like cave systems are become much more open for public access. People, as a leisure activity, will go down into cave systems, which probably didn't happen with the kind of technology that they had, say, 100 years ago. There are fewer natural roosting options close to the places that they want to feed. So we're clearing areas that have really good habitat, and in their place we're building buildings that actually provide cleaner, warmer, safer habitat for bats. Having been into some very modern building estates which haven't been built particularly well, we, after 18 months, are seeing bats in what I would call non-intended roosting provision. Not bat boxes that were put in, but roofs that were put on badly, things like that. I mean, bats will find a way if there are features suitable for areas that they want to feed in where they feel safe. And that's true of our 5 most common species. So our 5 most common species in the UK all have summer or winter roosting habitat that is related with man-made structures. And these man-made structures vary depending on what they mimic in the natural world. Tunnels, bridges are mimicking the kind of cave-like structures, and often buildings, crevices in buildings can mimic things like bark on trees. And we tend to divide the way that bats use our buildings into 4 different categories. It helps to get an understanding of where they might be, how they might be accessing them. So we have things like our crevice-dwelling species, and like it says, often hidden from view, generally in the external facade of the building, and I'll come on and show a little bit more detail on that in a minute, but things like our smallest species, common and soprano pipistrelles. They're about 4 grams in size. They used to say in these talks, you could fit them in a matchbox. It's not allowed to say that kind of thing now. They get through a gap as big as your thumb is what we tend to say instead now. Very, very small spaces. And you know, frequently people will tell us that they don't have bats in their buildings. They've never seen bats in their buildings. Well, as a bat expert of about 13 years, I've missed a lot of bats in buildings and we've known they're there. So it's very, very easy for these guys to go unnoticed. We've got roof void dwellers. They might be visible on the roof timbers. Sometimes they're hanging up sort of in the roof void where it's obvious. But again, only, you know, sometimes they like structures around chimneys, and it's not always possible to get a full safe view of them. So again, much investigation needs to be done to pick those out. The void and crevice dwellers, so those bats that are frequently found and their evidence is found in the roof void, but again can tuck themselves away, especially if disturbed. Things like our brown long-eared and natterers can again get into really, really tiny gaps. I've got some nice pictures coming up later of those. And what we consider to be void and flying space dwellers, and those are our greater and lesser horseshoes. They're the only species in our country that do the classic hanging by their feet, wings wrapped around them. From the discussions I frequently have, I think that's what a lot of people are expecting to see when they go into their roof void and they're looking for bats. And that is the classic film, the classic picture. And so there's a lot of work to be done to sort of say, well, that's only 2 of our species. And they are very regionally specific, so we only really find them in the south and southwest of England and Wales. So when people don't see those and don't find those, it can be difficult to have that conversation sometimes. So I'll start by looking at our crevice dwellers. Common and soprano pipistrelles, as I've said, they're about 4 grams in size. They can get into a gap as big as my thumb, but they are 2 most widespread and most common species. So very well recorded in field surveys, very well recorded through bat detectors, seen in people's gardens, allotments, cities, very under-recorded in buildings. And quite often there'll be 1 or 2 sort of tucked away, and you can easily miss them coming and going from the building. And these are the kind of structures that they use. Behind things like hanging tiles, fascia boards, barge boarding, really sort of tucked in these tiny little gaps. This drawing, the top right, there's a few lifted tiles there, and they're a little bit more obvious, but you could sometimes quite easily miss even features that have been put in to encourage bats because they're so small. They can also be found between the felt and the lining in flat roofs, underneath tiles, between tiles and the bitumen felt on a pitched roof structure, and they can get through things like weep holes into cavity walls, especially, I should say, south-facing walls for maternity roosts. They really like those. Be nice and warm, and they'll pack themselves in sometimes in really, really high numbers. And it's only probably then that people say, oh, I hear a noise, I hear a bit of scratching in the wall cavity. Most of the time, people don't hear anything, or they don't know that anything is there. So I've got a nice video, hopefully, fingers crossed, technology willing, of a common pipistrelle roost. So we've got some wooden boarding at the top there, some hanging tiles. You might just be able to see there's a very small piece of lifted lead flashing, no more than 20 mil, and hopefully we'll, yes. You just hear their calls in the background. Now, this is with a night vision camera at a known maternity roost where we know the exit and there's only one exit, and still, blink and you'd miss it. I mean, it's very, very easy to miss where these guys are roosting. Looking at some of the roof void dwellers, Ceratine, much larger bat, you can see there in comparative size, fits about across sort of the width of 3 fingers on an adult hand as compared to pipistrelle, which only fit across the width of about 2. Generally restricted to the south of England and really closely associated with this sort of Victorian age or older 1900 kind of buildings. They like to be around the chimney space, at the gable end, and sometimes in the roof space as well. But they don't roost in great numbers. So again, it can be easy to miss them. There won't necessarily be a lot of droppings. The droppings won't necessarily always indicate what species you've got. There are some people who are bat dropping experts. I am not a bat dropping expert, and I'm glad for things like technology and especially things like DNA analysis, which makes our job a lot easier now, working out what we've got, especially when you can't find the bats. We've got our void and crevice dwellers. These are really our little superstars, the brown long-eared, my personal favourite. These are the ones that we put on all of our kind of press releases. They kind of win people over with their lovely little faces, and they're quite often the ones that we get calls to our helpline about. So the Bat Conservation Trust has a national bat helpline that runs 365 days a year. In the summer we have extra seasonal staff, and it will run actually 24 hours a day during the summer period. And these guys are the ones that people will go up into their loft space to put something in, and they'll just be sat there looking, just peering down at them. And they're quite a nice idea as well. We just say, well, what do they look like? They've got massive ears. Right, okay, brilliant. Brown long-eareds are more commonly associated with buildings than the much rarer grey long-eared, so you can be fairly sure that's what you're looking at. If the bats aren't there, some nice bits of evidence. You can just see I've circled an area that's smooth with sort of cobwebs. It's got a little bit of oil on from their fur because they like to groom themselves, very well groomed. They have their sort of fur to keep them in really good conditions, to keep them warm. And you can maybe see a smattering of droppings along the wood, but still, you know, brown long-eareds don't always roost in very large numbers. A maternity roost for brown long-eareds can be maybe 10 to 20 bats, and they might move about in the roof void depending on the temperature. So again, those are the kind of evidence that you would look for, but potentially easy to miss as there's only small numbers. They're quite oftenly associated with woodlands. They're one of our slow-flying species, so they're quite happy in cluttered environments. They're quite happy hunting insects off the vegetation. They'll often choose older houses with large open roof spaces. They like to fly around and be in the open roof space. And you quite often find them, like these guys, at the top of the ridge beam, the gable end, and also around the chimney structure. Now, another one of our sort of void and crevice dwellers is the Natura's bat. It's one of our myotis group of bats, much more difficult to identify through echolocation calls. It's been severely affected by things like barn conversions. It's very closely associated with old stone buildings and large timber frame buildings. What you're looking at bottom right is, I mean, a bit of an ecologist's nightmare, to be honest, in terms of surveying so many cracks and crevices in these old barn structures. And either they're up for conversion or potentially change of use, so open to the public. We have quite a number of these barns that are of historical importance, and people want to be able to support them with donations for the public and open them up. It's how you balance that with knowing that there are bats roosting there and finding where the bats are roosting and limiting things like lighting. And I'll talk a little bit more about lighting in a minute. Actually, the crevice on the left-hand side, it hasn't come out quite as well, but there are 3 bats in there in the top of that structure, and you can see in the photo at the top just how small that gap is, and often things like endoscopes are going to be the only way that you're going to be finding those bats. And then we come to the void and sort of flying space dwellers, our two species, the lesser and greater horseshoe. So the lesser horseshoe is probably about the size of a plum, and the greater horseshoe is about the size of a pear, to think comparatively, hanging up by their feet. As I've said, they're very closely, they're rare in the UK, they're sort of regionally common in the south. They're originally cave dwellers, so again, closely associated with where we have limestone caves. It says they now often use cellars. Cellars of large buildings, but again, these are the kind of spaces that are becoming rarer and rarer as people convert these large buildings. There's not often these days the kind of space and provision, especially for a species that likes to have an opening to fly into. And we'll talk a little bit more about things like buildings that have a good energy footprint and are well sealed. How do you make provision for these species that like gaps to fly into? And so I've obviously talked a lot about bats, but we have a number of birds that I would say occupy similar niches and need similar considerations and can be thought of in terms of those that like to be out more in the open, those like to be more closed nesting places, and things like barn owls that like a space to fly into to be able to access before they reach a place where they're actually going to nest. And hopefully, from what I've covered so far, you start to get a feeling of just how porous our buildings are to bats and bird species. And I've deliberately put modern buildings on these drawings. I get a lot of questions as well from people who think that bats classically don't exist anywhere other than big old Gothic structures. And actually, when you think how cold and damp a lot of these buildings are, why wouldn't they go for modern, warm homes and office blocks? Especially when you consider the spaces they can get into. It doesn't take long for a tile to lift or slip, a little bit of lead flashing to come away, a little bit of mortar to come out at the top of the ridge tile, and suddenly there's a perfect little access point for them and nobody's even noticed. And even if these buildings undergo regular maintenance, it might be that as long as that particular defect isn't actually causing any damage to the building, they might just leave it. Or, and this is the real issue for them, or they might just pop that tile back in place. They might just push down that bit of lead flashing, as we saw in the video, and that's where the real issues are. Things like building maintenance and developments, and also thinking about building new builds that have none of those defects in, none of those cavities, none of those little holes, and that's where we felt like we needed to start thinking about technical guidance. And so this is how we came about developing at BCT the Designing for Biodiversity. This is actually the second edition, and it's been a great example of how you need to get not just industry people on board, but that whole, we work with a lot of fantastic conservation charities such as the RSPB, Swift Conservation, Action for Swifts, the Barn Owl Trust. We wouldn't be able to get done what we get done without this cooperative working, this shared knowledge, and also to be able to present to the industry just how important this is. And then we have people like, Reba providing that technical advice. And so we hope to develop, documents like this that appeal to both industry and also to the ecologists that will be picking them up. So everybody's speaking sort of the same language. So these are some of the examples of the kind of solutions that we present as part of this document. I believe there are some outside if people want to go and have a look at them as well, and there's links on our website. So thinking about integrated solutions for those species that like to dwell in crevices or enclosed structures, we've got a couple of really nice examples of integrated boxes that fit within the skin of the cavity wall. The box is completely enclosed, so it doesn't allow access to the swifts or the bats beyond that structure. However, because it's built into the wall, it means that it's more thermally stable, but it also means that it's not likely to fall off or get damaged or be removed, more importantly, at a later date. Most of the time, people don't even know that they're there. And so it can completely depend on the developers I'm speaking to. Some of them want very high-end finishes, and they want to be able to skim the wall, and so you can't see anything of the access point at the end. It's just something at the top of the building. Other places like schools want to be able to integrate them, but to have lovely bat logos, and so to encourage people to think about having bats in their buildings and how it's a good thing. So there are all different options, really. But the important thing is to note is, because we have developed this guidance with REBA, is that none of these compromise the energy efficiency of the building, which is what we're often asked about, which is a big issue. They will, they're perfectly in step with building regulations. Again, we've got just an example of something very simple as an integrated solution. Bottom left, just a few lifted hanging tiles, just allowing access to the space behind the tiles, and that will be a south-facing wall, somewhere lovely and warm where the bats can move around behind that structure, and that's a very, very simple solution for them. We've got some more sort of external solutions. So the middle two are external bat boxes made from it's a recycled material, 80% recycled, made from sort of polystyrene and a concrete mix. They can be sort of painted any colour that people want. However, you do have the issue that they are attached to the building, and there is the potential for damage from either from being removed or from being knocked during maintenance works, or even really bad weather. And so it's important to put them places that are sheltered, and also away from things like external light sources. We've also got some external Swift boxes at the bottom right. Again, they're almost identical to the kind of structures that are embedded in the walls. However, they're external, and again, potentially open to damage or removal at a later date. However, they can be cheaper and more cost effective, and especially when you're not talking to the developer and you're talking to the homeowner and they want to know something that they can add to the building for benefiting biodiversity, these can be a really nice, simple, easy solution. Sometimes we speak to people who don't have structures on their sites who want to make provision for biodiversity. So we work quite closely with the minerals industry, for example, and they might have a quarry site which they're converting back to wildlife, and there are no trees and there are no buildings. So what we've got top right is what's known as a rocket box, and they're in the style of the American bat boxes, and these can be mounted on large poles next to hedge lines and tree lines, reed beds, places like that. So we try and work quite closely with a number of bat box manufacturers to see what the market needs, to gauge what's out there, and then develop designs. So part of my job is also to feed back what works, what doesn't work to these bat box manufacturers, and to encourage improvement of the design as we go along. And that's another nice external solution for peregrine falcon nesting tray, and that's a drawing from Designing for Biodiversity. We've got some information on roof void access, and this can be as simple as having an access tile, and you can have an access tile, a little bit of the bitumen felt, and then you can create almost a little Scrabble way for them that takes them into the roof void. There are a number of different designs of tiles, and again, the more that people ask for these kind of things, the more bespoke that they become. These are just some of the examples of the companies that I work regularly with. But yeah, it's quite nice. It's quite nice. We've got solutions in there that are, off the shelf and to buy, but we've also got companies that are willing to be creative and to develop whatever people are looking for, really. And that's sort of through the roof, directly through the roof access, but also there are a number of ways of creating access and crawl spaces coming from sort of the soffit areas, and either access into the entire roof void, or especially where we've had cases where maybe there's been a problem with the number of bats or smell, or rarely the amount of guano in a roof space, you can potentially have boxed off areas that only the bats are in, and as long as they are big enough and meet their needs, then the bats are also partitioned off from disturbance as well, and people can actually use their roof space and the bats are protected. So there's a lot of different solutions, really. These are sort of just to give some ideas, and especially when you're thinking about mitigation for the loss of a roost, rather than building a whole new roost. It will very much depend on what species you've got there already and how they're using that structure as to what you need to replace and which of these designs will be suitable. And last of all, so of the open access to roofs and nest spaces. The barn owl one's a bit more straightforward. They like to be able to land and have that sort of platform before they go into sort of the barn structure. But for the horseshoes, they tend to create these tunnel-like structures, and the big issue for our horseshoe species, again, is predation. Once the cleverer bird species, especially like crows, have worked out where the bats are coming and going, you've got to be able to create a structure where they can't either get up and in through that tunnel, or they can't wait at the entrance to pick them off. So yeah, there's been a lot of investigating how can we make the structure more slippery, how can we put things in. I've seen like little roller bars that when the birds step on them, they roll away from them. There's a lot of trying to outwit things like crows when it comes to designing access for bats, because you'll quite often see them waiting around on the roof structure to pick them off. And so I've talked about the building itself, but obviously what's important for the bats, how are they going to find it? I mean, this is a new build estate that's got a number of bird and bat boxes, but I don't know how they expect the bats to find them. Very open areas. All the habitat that was there was removed and has been replaced with either nothing or very, very small trees. And so what bats really want is well thought out, beautiful, functional green infrastructure. It doesn't have to be as big or as glitzy as some of these sort of central London projects. It just has to work. It has to work for biodiversity, but also it can be multifunctional. It can provide, as we've talked about, control of heat island effect, can control water flow and flooding in our cities. There's numerous uses for it. It presents a lovely social space in our cities as well. I think we don't join up at the moment enough of that thought for what do we provide for people, what do we provide for biodiversity, for our own well-being. It's all basically can be under one umbrella if it's thought about well enough. The last thing that I sort of really wanted to focus on, and that's been a major part of work for me over the last couple of years, is the problem with artificial light pollution. So green infrastructure is all very well and good. You can plan these lovely networks and corridors, but if in the day it looks like it's a connected habitat, but you come back at night and there's light everywhere dividing it up, it's a real issue. For our slow-flying species, artificial light pollution is one of the main reasons that they won't, they can't adapt to use our cities. They feel that threat of predation so keenly, and for example, we have peregrine falcons hunting bats in London. I mean, it just shows they come out into the lit areas, they can see the bats, and those are our fast-flying species. So the fast-flying species, they're seeing insects, especially attracted to UV light sources, and they're opportunistic. I would say that we have the kind of light-impacted, light-sensitive species and light-opportunistic species. None of our species are tolerant of light. It damages all of them to a certain extent. Some of our fast-flying species are able to live in our cities and come in and out the lights to feed. But there was a recent study that showed that where you have gaps in the vegetation and you add lighting, it still creates a barrier effect, as it does for the slow-flying species. So I try and get people to think about planning their cities during the day, but also how is it going to look at night. And this is some additional best practice guidance that we've just published in September. We brought out the Bats and Artificial Lighting in the UK. It's a document that we've produced with the Institution of Lighting Professionals, and it's very much a practical guide. It covers the research, but it also covers the technical details about the types of lighting that's out there, what's more damaging to bats, what is, especially at LEDs, what's more useful. We get a lot of complaints that LEDs are very bright, and they can be very bright, but they can also be fantastic tools. You can do all sorts with LEDs. They're brand new technology. So it's not the tool itself, it's how it's used. And a lot of our discussions in the document are about having ecologists and lighting designers sitting down at the start of a project, everybody talking at the start of the project about how they plan out a particular development rather than being brought in at the end. And in October, another document I was involved in producing, a Eurobats document on guidelines for consideration of lighting when you've got bats. Both of these, I should say, are free and available to download from our website. And we've just got a brand new website, so it should be much easier for people to find them. And again, the Eurobats document is an overarching document. There's a lot of research in there, which is really interesting. And then it's a bit lighter on kind of the practical mitigation, because there's such a variety across Europe, depending on local planning laws, things like that. But if you would like any more detail on any of those, then do let me know. And the last thing I'd like to cover is some other considerations that need to be made when we're thinking about designing, especially for bats. And this is something that I'm hearing more and more about, and it's been a big issue for us for a number of years in the UK, modern roofing membranes. So as compared to the original bitumen felts, modern roofing membranes are made up of very, very long fibres. They're curled up and they're compressed, and they're very light, but these fibres can be pulled loose, and unfortunately bats will get tangled in them and they can die. So there are no modern roofing membranes that are suitable for use in bat roosts, and that is known as part of mitigation. I think what's more concerning is that when you consider how much they're used now in all buildings, modern buildings, and then you start to think, as these buildings start to degrade a bit and there are gaps, are bats going to be accessing areas where there's modern roofing membranes where you didn't intend them to? Potentially. So it's a big issue for the moment, and something that we're trying to do some research on. Solar panels, again, the addition of solar panels might disturb a roost, might block access, might change the temperature within a roof space. We've been finding this is less of an issue since all the subsidies were pulled, unfortunately, for solar panels. We did have a lot of issues with it, and now we're finding that not that many people are actually are using them, are taking them up as much. And things like insulation. So the addition of insulation to the loft space can block access points, can also disturb bats themselves, and then there's insulation that goes inside the cavity wall. These two are of a big concern to us, and again, we're trying to talk to industry about how can we provide solutions, when do you bring the experts in, and just raising awareness. But there is actually a Eurobats document that I'm involved in developing at the moment, where we're trying to bring together as much as we know across through our European partners on these issues. So what are our next steps? Well, I think that although we've had some really good feedback on designing for biodiversity, I still meet a lot of architects who've never heard of it. I meet a lot of people, ecologists, that have never heard of it. How can we make it more accessible? I've already had some really good discussions here about potentially how we can make it more accessible, how we can maybe roll it out not just more in our country, but potentially in other countries. Updating advice with the latest research and knowledge. These things develop very quickly. Designing for biodiversity was done in 2012. 6 years is, it's a long time in terms of building technologies, that kind of thing. So again, we're having a meeting with REBA in a few weeks' time to say, where are we now? What can we do next? What are the key things that we need to know about potential building materials, potential threats to bats, and also opportunities? Revisiting some of the case studies, can we get more monitoring data, and can we encourage that discussion? There's a lot of work being put in, there's a lot of provisions. We know that there's so many bat and bird boxes bought in the UK, but the amount of data that we get from them comparatively is very small. So how can we get access to that data and really understand what's working? Feedback from industry on the practicalities of use. Again, there's no point producing documents if industry say, well, that's not going to work, basically. So we keep in good contact with REBA, with people like the Institute of Lighting Professionals to really find out what actually works. And like I was saying, linking better to the social value and well-being agendas. These are really massive for us in the UK at the moment. There's a lot of investment going into social value and well-being within developments, and how you can make your development have a higher social value and well-being. I don't see why biodiversity shouldn't fit directly alongside that agenda, and then essentially you're making a business case for it. And I've been in a lot of meetings recently where I'm selling them biodiversity essentially alongside social value and well-being, and I think that's the next step for us, really. And then engagement, workshops, seminars and training. I'm always looking for new opportunities to reach different crowds and people that are going to take this up and potentially roll it out within their own organisations. And so that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour from me on the topic. Thank you very much for listening. Our website has got all of the documents I've talked about. This is why I use the brown long-eared. It always gets a nice little R at the end of my talk. That's my email address. I've also got cards on me. I'm around for the rest of the day and tomorrow if anybody would like to talk to me about any of this. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.